So we are clearly celebrating the resurrection today. We are engaging in the Easter story, and this has been a long time coming. We have spent now 40 days in the church season of Lent, from Ash Wednesday all the way getting us to this point, and we began Holy Week a week ago today, where we talked about, I guess you could call it a parade of sorts, where we talked about Jesus and his triumphal entry into Jerusalem in a somewhat unexpected way. In fact, in a quite unexpected way, he comes into the city with his disciples for his final mission before his death on the cross. And the people welcome him, waving palm branches, taking off their cloaks, and laying them in the road. Of course, it would only be a short matter of time until things would turn rather significantly, but get us to this point of resurrection. I was reminded recently of a story that a visiting professor, told me in a preaching class years ago. He was visiting us from out of town, and he was telling us about a different parade, or maybe it's better to describe it as a march, that he heard about as a child growing up in Georgia. So he came and visited this seminary class, and he shared this as part of a sermon one day, and I'd like to share this story with you. And it's actually kind of a troubling story in many ways, but I hope you'll understand why I'm telling it by the end. He told the story of when he was a little boy, there was this community not far from where he grew up, somewhere in Georgia, he didn't specify. And he said that there was a neighborhood that was primarily, in fact, maybe exclusively African-American community. And this community was a wonderful place for children to grow up. It was a place where the neighborhood was thriving. Everybody had wonderful relationships with each other, with their neighbors, a safe place. Children were happy, played freely, and everyone got along great. It was really an idyllic place in many ways, despite being in a segregated city. He went on to say that everything was good in this community except for one day a year. And on that one day of year, people usually had the heads up that it was coming. But what happened on that one day is that the Klan would robe up and march through the streets in a show of intimidation, fear-mongering, sowing their seeds of hatred. And the residents of that community would go inside when they knew that that was coming. They'd lock the door, flip the deadbolt, pull the shades closed, turn off all the lights, and hide. It was almost as if they were expecting a tornado outside. Year after year, this was the practice. The march is tomorrow. Be ready. At some point, we don't know exactly when, something changed. Maybe it was some community leaders got together and said, let's do something different. And I'm sure somebody said, let's show a show of force. Let's meet them in the streets and say, you're not going to march down this street today. And maybe someone else said, maybe we can appeal to them, or maybe we should write an editorial to the local newspaper. I got to imagine that there were some others that got together and said, we can't let this continue to happen. We don't want our children to be experiencing this and growing up, at least for one day of the year, living in petrified fear. But however they came to the idea, they arrived at a decision, and they were going to do something different that year. That year was not like any different than any other. The Klan robed up, they put on their pointy hats, they started to march. And when they rounded the corner into that neighborhood, they were met with a most surprising scene. All of the residents, instead of being inside, closing the drapes, locking the doors, they instead had taken their lawn chairs and their picnic blankets, and they brought them out onto the boulevard and onto the sidewalk, and they sat out there, and somebody popped popcorn, and people brought out snacks. And as the marchers came down the street, they pointed, and they laughed, and they hooted, and they howled, and they treated it was just a grand old time, and made a foolish mockery of the whole thing for the absurdity that it actually was. And that was the last time that march ever took place in that city. Hatred was stifled. Fear was dispelled. Terror had gone away. And it started with a laugh And it started with the decision that this will be no more. Today we celebrate a story that in many ways has a similar kind of tune. God looked at the foolishness of humanity. God saw the mistakes, the hurt we were causing, the violence that was being perpetrated against one another. He saw that people who had enough didn't often give to the people who didn't have anything. He saw people that were being treated differently than other people, that justice was in short supply, that the empire was taking full control, and that people did not have the freedoms that they were intended to live with. And God said with a chuckle, and I imagine a smirk, enough is enough. And I am going to put an end to this, and hatred will be done away with. Injustice will go away. And at least for a fleeting moment, death will be no more. And God said, I am going to take my son who is coming to this world to bring justice, to bring love, to bring peace, to bring joy, and to spread grace. And today will be the day that it ends. And the tomb was emptied. The sun came up. Jesus arose from the dead. And Easter was here to stay. And the funny thing about the church is we read this story every year, and we read the account of the women and of the disciples, and every time they're astonished with what has taken place. I mean, don't get me wrong, a resurrection from the dead is an astonishing thing. And we'll hear more about this in the weeks to come, and we'll hear about the disciples and how they were living fearfully for a long time, and how Jesus appeared to them, and then Thomas wasn't there when Jesus appeared, and so he's doubtful about that, and he gets another chance at it too. But all the while, there's this astonishment. But the funny thing is that God has been telling us this story in some form or another since the beginning of time. I mean, this has been God's modus operandi the whole time. And yet we're surprised that God raises Jesus. I mean, Jesus himself tells his disciples, this is gonna happen on the third day. And when he does exactly what he says he's gonna do, everybody's astonished and amazed. But it really goes back further than that. And once again, it began with a laugh and a chuckle. See, it goes back far to the beginning of the Bible, when Jesus, or rather God, sent a messenger to meet with an old couple, 200 years of age between the two of them. And he said to them, out of you, couple, I am going to make an entire nation, and their descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and you will be the couple that starts this. And Sarah laughed. And God says, you think that's funny? Watch this. And then the story continued, and not too many generations later, there was one of 12 sons whose brothers became so jealous of him that they sold him into slavery. He gets thrown into a pit, sold to slaves, sold as a slave to nomadic travelers. They take him into the heart of Egypt. He ends up being imprisoned there, interprets dreams, and becomes the Pharaoh's right-hand man, inviting the rest of his family down to Egypt. Crisis averted during a time of famine. And when we think that this isn't possible, God says, watch this. It wouldn't be possible to have somebody who grew up in that culture then as a baby at a time when the Pharaoh is so fearful that the Jewish population is getting so big that they might have an insurrection. And so the Pharaoh commands that all baby boys must be tossed into the river and killed upon their birth. And one baby is spared, put in a tiny makeshift basket, and set adrift into the vast Nile River. And lo and behold, the Pharaoh's daughter, bathing at the riverside, pulls the baby out of the basket, raises him as her own, and that one would be the one who would eventually lead all of the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, and into the wilderness. And 40 years of surviving in the wilderness, avoiding starvation, avoiding death, avoiding illness and war. And God said, you like that? Watch this. Then we go on further. What happens next? They're going to go into the promised land, and God says, oh, you don't think I can make a prostitute the hero of the story? Yeah, she's going to help the spies. Watch this. Oh, you don't think I can take the youngest son, a shepherd boy? Yeah, not only is he going to be your future king, and he's going to be anointed on this day as the runt of the litter, but he is also going to be the giant slayer, literally, in your family, and his fame is going to spread far and wide. Watch this. You don't think that I can rescue 3 of my young men from a fiery furnace and take another from a lion's den? Watch this. And that's when God is just getting warmed up, because we are now building to the grand finale. He says, I'm going to send my son into the world. He is going to resist temptation. He is going to perform miracles. He is going to teach people that have never been able to be reached before. He is going to dine with sinners and tax collectors and lepers and everybody else that society casts aside. Watch this. And then when everybody says, okay, we believe it, he's the king, bring him into the city. Let's bring him in. Let's bring him in for his coronation. It's time to overtake the empire. Get his chariot ready. God says, watch this. How about a donkey? How about a crown of thorns for the king? How about I let him be used and abused by you, kicked, spit on, cursed, flogged, hung on a cross, facing Roman capital punishment through torture. And just when that looks like it's going to be it, God says, watch this. The women go to the tomb. The earth shakes. The tomb rolls away, and it's empty. But that's not the end, because God still has a wonderful sense of humor, and I think God is chuckling through the whole thing, just laughing at our foolishness for thinking that that was going to be the last word. Overcoming death is not enough for God, because God says, oh yeah, those soldiers, they're there to protect the dead man in the tomb. How about this for irony? When the women get there and the earth shakes and the stone rolls away, they're going to appear as dead men, and the dead man's going to get up and walk out of the tomb. Oh, and get this. You know who's going to be the first ones to spot the risen Jesus? Women. Women 2,000 years ago. That's right. And not only that, they're going to go then tell the men the good news and tell the men to get to Galilee. Why Galilee? Because Galilee is known as Galilee of the Gentiles, which means now that God says, by the way, this local thing that I'm doing with Jesus is not going to be local anymore. It's not just for the Jewish people. This is going global. Watch this. And finally, God says, oh yeah, and some unfinished business. This sign of torture, this sign of terror, fear, and intimidation by force, that's going to be the symbol for my church. That's going to stand empty as a reminder to what I can do. Watch this. Watch this. All throughout this season of Lent here at Grace, we have been looking at the story from the Gospel according to Matthew. And so you heard the first part of the story, and as we finish this morning, I want to read the concluding part of the resurrection account. It's picking up with verse 8. So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, and they ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him and they took hold of his feet and they worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." There's something that happens in Matthew's gospel that's so profoundly different than the other accounts of the resurrection. We started off this whole season of Lent talking about the Sermon on the Mount. That's how Jesus begins his ministry in Matthew, with a sermon. He's got only a handful of disciples at that time and a group of people who are sort of curious onlookers, and he gathers them in and he begins to teach them. And he says, I'm going to share with you a series of blessings. These are the first words of his ministry. I'm going to share you who is blessed. And they're probably thinking, we know who's blessed. The wealthy, the powerful, the religious leaders. You might even say some of the Roman leaders. And Jesus, as if anticipating, says, watch this. How about the persecuted, the mourning and grieving, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? What about those who are the meek among us? And how about the poor in spirit. In other words, all of the people that you have disregarded, all the people that you have put on blinders and failed to see, all the people that we want to inconveniently forget because it's too easy for us to just go through life as normal and not see them, those are the ones that I'm going to prioritize first. Those are the ones that I'm going to say is blessed. And then I'm going to open it up to everyone else. But we're going to start with the disenfranchised, the alienated, the marginalized, the hurting, the sick. The priority begins with them. But then there's this other thing that Matthew does in that reading I just did, and I don't know if you caught this, but let me make it clear. He says that the women go to the tomb and find it empty. Mary and Mary. As they walk away, a messenger, an angel perhaps, greets them and says, Jesus isn't here, he's been raised. Go and tell the other disciples. So they start to go, and as they start to go down the path, Jesus appears to them. It says Jesus met them on the road. Now, Matthew could have told this story in any other way that he wanted to. It's his story. He gets to control the account of the story. And each of the disciples do this a little bit differently, or each of the gospel writers. But Matthew, when he says Jesus met them on the road, isn't making a claim about geographically where this moment happened. It's the Jesus met them part that's significant. This is a theological detail that Matthew is including. This cannot be overlooked because this is important to all of us, which is when Jesus wants us, Jesus meets us. He doesn't wait to be discovered. He doesn't sit back in the tomb and say, come find me. He goes out to meet the people where they are. Do you see the difference in that? Jesus is not content to let things be. He is going to the people. He is going to meet them where they are, and Jesus continues to do the same with us, meeting us where we are. So whether this has been the best year or the worst year of your life, whether you feel like you are a pious and penitent person, or whether you feel like you are someone who barely can cross the threshold of the church for fear of bursting in flames, which, by the way, never has happened. Jesus meets us where we are. He is Jesus to all of us. And if we look at the beginning of the gospel, what does he say? I am going to first prioritize the people who are hurting, the meek, the lonely, the isolated, the ostracized, everyone else who has been shunned or cast aside. That's where I'm going first. And I am going to meet everyone where they are. I am going to meet you, whether you are male or female, whether you are young or old, white or black or brown, gay or straight, rich or poor. I am going to find you. I am going to meet you. You are my priority. I love you. And if you don't believe that this is possible, watch this. We celebrate the risen Savior, the one who overcame hatred, injustice, oppression, selfishness, sin, greed, power, and death to find us. And God's not done, because when we encounter the risen Christ, I have to imagine he does a little smirk, laughs, and says, "We're not done. Watch this."